November 19, 1944. A cold rain fell across the Massachusetts countryside as a military transport truck rumbled through the gates of a makeshift prisoner of war facility outside Worcester. Inside the canvas-covered bed, 23 German women sat in silence, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. Among them was 25-year-old Hannelore Schmidt, known to her companions as Lori. She clutched a thin coat around her shoulders and tried to stop her hands from shaking. It wasn't just the cold that made her tremble, it was the certainty of what awaited them. For months, perhaps years, these women had been told exactly what to expect from American captivity. The propaganda had been relentless and specific. Americans were cruel, barbaric people who starved their prisoners, who took pleasure in the suffering of their enemies. The women had heard stories of POW camps where German soldiers were beaten daily, where food was withheld as punishment, where the Geneva Convention was ignored completely. Some of the younger women had been told that American soldiers were little better than animals, driven by base instincts and lacking any sense of honor or dignity. Laura had served as a radio operator for the Wehrmacht, intercepting Allied communications from a station in occupied France. She had been good at her job, proud even, believing she was helping to defend her homeland from those who wished to destroy German culture and civilization. When Allied forces overran their position in September, she and her fellow Auxiliary Corps members had been captured so quickly there had been no time to destroy their equipment or their documents. The shame of capture still burned in her chest. Sitting beside her was 22-year-old Ursula Weber, called Uschi by everyone who knew her. Uschi had worked as a clerical assistant, managing supply records for German forces. Her hands, once smooth from office work, were now rough and chapped. She had barely spoken since their capture, communicating mostly through nods and quiet gestures. But Laura could see the fear in her friend's eyes, the same fear that churned in her own stomach. Across from them sat 32-year-old Mechthild Braun, known as Tilda. She was the oldest of their group and carried herself with a dignity that even captivity could not diminish. Tilda had served as a senior administrative officer and had seen much more of the war than the younger women. Her face was harder, more resigned. She had told them during the long journey across the Atlantic that they should expect nothing from the Americans except cruelty. It was better to prepare for the worst than to harbor false hope. 19-year-old Sieglinde Klein, called Siggy, sat wedged between two other prisoners, her eyes wide with barely contained terror. She was the youngest among them, fresh-faced despite the grime of travel. And then there was 27-year-old Edelgard Hartmann, called Adel, whose suspicious nature had only intensified since capture. She trusted no one, especially not their captors. The truck lurched to a stop. Guards shouted orders in English that none of them fully understood. The canvas flap opened, revealing an American soldier's face. Whatever came next, Laura thought, they would face it together. They had to believe they would survive this. The processing took less than an hour. The women were photographed, their names recorded in ledgers they could not read, their few possessions cataloged and stored. American officers spoke to them through a translator, a German-American corporal whose accent carried traces of both worlds. The women were told the rules of the camp, informed of their rights under the Geneva Convention, and assigned to barracks. Everything was efficient, almost businesslike, but it was the absence of cruelty that unsettled them most. Where were the beatings they had been promised? Where was the deliberate humiliation? By early evening, the women found themselves being led to a large dining hall. The building was simple but clean, with long tables arranged in neat rows. Steam rose from somewhere in the back, carrying with it a smell that made Laura's stomach clench with sudden, painful hunger. It was the scent of cooking meat, real meat. Not the watery soup or moldy bread they had subsisted on during their journey, but actual food being prepared with care. An American sergeant stood at the entrance to the serving line, gesturing for them to take trays and utensils. The women moved forward hesitantly, exchanging confused glances. Behind a metal counter, kitchen staff in white aprons began placing food on their plates. Laura watched in disbelief as a thick slice of liver, cooked with onions until it glistened with juice, was set on her tray. Beside it came a mound of mashed potatoes, rich with butter. Green beans followed, and 2 slices of fresh white bread that still held warmth from the oven. Ushi, standing behind Laura, made a small sound of shock. Her hands trembled as she accepted her own plate, loaded with the same impossible abundance. Tilda's face had gone carefully blank, revealing nothing of what she might be thinking. Young Siggy looked as though she might cry. Adel's eyes narrowed with immediate suspicion. They carried their trays to a table and sat in silence, staring at the food before them. Around them, other newly arrived prisoners were having the same reaction, frozen between desperate hunger and paralyzing fear. At adjacent tables, American soldiers ate identical meals, laughing and talking among themselves as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "It's poisoned," Edel whispered in German, her voice tight with certainty. "It must be. Why else would they give us this?" "They're eating the same food," Ushi observed quietly, watching the American soldiers. "Look, the same plates, the same portions." "A trick," Edel insisted. "They want us to trust them before—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They had all been taught what to expect from their enemies. Kindness was simply another weapon, used to lower defenses before the real cruelty began. Laura picked up her fork. Her hand shook as she cut a small piece of liver. The meat was tender, the onions sweet and perfectly caramelized. She had not tasted anything like it in more than 2 years. Slowly, driven by hunger stronger than fear, she raised the fork to her lips and took that first life-changing bite. The flavor exploded across Laura's tongue with an intensity that was almost painful. The liver was rich and savory, seasoned with salt and pepper, the onions adding sweetness that made her eyes water. For a moment, she simply sat there, the fork still in her mouth, unable to process what she was experiencing. This was real food, actual meat, cooked with care and skill. Not the thin gruel they had eaten in France, not the stale bread and watery soup from the transport ship. This was a meal that someone had prepared with attention and pride. Around her, the other women watched her reaction with desperate intensity. If Laura fell over dead in the next few seconds, they would know. If she began convulsing from poison, they would be warned. But Laura simply swallowed, cut another piece, and took a second bite, then a third. Her body, starved for so long, seemed to wake up all at once, demanding more. Ushi was next. She started with the mashed potatoes, taking a tiny spoonful and tasting it cautiously. Her eyes widened. Real butter, real cream. She had grown up on a farm in Bavaria and knew the taste of genuine dairy. This was not margarine or some poor substitute. This was the real thing, probably fresher than anything she had eaten in years of rationing back home. Young Siggy could not contain herself any longer. 19 years old and still growing, she had been hungry for so long that the sight of food overwhelmed her caution. She picked up her fork and began eating with barely controlled desperation, tears streaming down her face as she chewed. The other women at nearby tables watched this display, and something seemed to break in them. Forks began to move. Mouths began to chew. The dining hall filled with the sound of eating, punctuated by occasional sobs from women who had forgotten what it meant to have enough. Only Edel and Tilda held back. Tilda watched the American soldiers carefully, studying their faces for any sign of mockery or malicious satisfaction. But the Americans were not paying attention to the German prisoners. They were focused on their own meals, their own conversations. One young private was writing a letter while he ate. Another was reading a newspaper. They showed no interest in whether the prisoners ate or not. "Tilda," Laura said softly, her voice hoarse with emotion, "please, eat something. It's real. It's safe." Tilda looked at her plate for a long moment, then picked up her fork with the slow deliberation of someone making an important decision. She cut a piece of liver, examined it carefully, and placed it in her mouth. Her expression did not change, but she swallowed, and then she took another bite. Adel was the last to surrender. She watched them all eating, watched the American soldiers ignoring them, and finally, with visible reluctance, she tasted the food. Her face remained hard and suspicious, but she continued eating. Hunger, it seemed, was more powerful than ideology or fear. Behind the serving counter, Staff Sergeant Thomas Kowalski wiped down the metal surfaces with the same methodical care he brought to everything in his kitchen. He was a broad-shouldered man of 42, with thick forearms and hands that bore the scars of years working with hot pans and sharp knives. He had been cooking in the Army for nearly 20 years, ever since he enlisted during the hardest years of the Depression, when feeding people seemed like the most important job in the world. Kowalski came from a Polish family in Chicago, immigrants who had arrived in America with nothing but determination and a willingness to work. His mother had taught him that food was more than sustenance. It was dignity. It was respect. It was the most basic way of saying to another human being, "You matter." Even when his family had barely enough to eat themselves, his mother had always made sure there was something to offer visitors, some small gesture of hospitality that affirmed their shared humanity. When Kowalski had been assigned to this POW facility and told he would be feeding German women prisoners, he had not hesitated. His commanding officer had asked if he had any objections, given that his cousins were fighting Germans in Europe. Kowalski had simply shook his head. "They're prisoners, sir. That means we feed them proper. That's what the Geneva Convention says, and that's what we do." But Kowalski went beyond the minimum requirements. The regulations stated that prisoners should receive adequate nutrition to maintain health. That was all. But Kowalski believed in feeding people the way his mother had taught him, with care and attention to what made a meal satisfying rather than merely sufficient. He had requisitioned the best ingredients he could get through military supply channels. He had trained his kitchen staff to prepare food with the same standards they would use for American soldiers. And he had insisted that every meal, even breakfast, should include protein and vegetables in proper proportions. Tonight, watching the German women file through his serving line, he had seen the shock on their faces. He had seen the fear and suspicion, the way their hands trembled as they accepted the plates. He had also seen the hunger in their eyes, the kind of deep starvation that came from months or years of inadequate food. It was a look he remembered from the Depression, from bread lines in Chicago where people waited for hours just to get a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. One of the women had caught his attention particularly. She was thin but carried herself with a certain defensive pride, her jaw set in a hard line even as she accepted her food. Dark-haired, sharp-eyed, radiating distrust like heat from a stove. That would be Edelgard Hartmann, according to the roster he had been given. The translator had warned him that some of the prisoners were deeply indoctrinated, convinced that Americans were barbaric and cruel. Kowalski simply nodded. He had dealt with suspicious eaters before. The food would speak for itself. It always did. That night, lying in her narrow bunk in the barracks, Laura could not sleep. Her stomach felt strange, almost uncomfortably full after the meal. She was not accustomed to that sensation anymore. For the past 2 years, hunger had been her constant companion, a gnawing emptiness that never quite went away, no matter how much thin soup or stale bread she consumed. Now, fed properly for the first time in so long, her body did not quite know how to respond. She thought about the last real meal she had eaten in Germany. It was Christmas of 1942, more than 2 years ago. Her mother had saved ration cards for weeks to make something special. They had managed a small goose, hardly enough for the family but stretched with potatoes and cabbage. Even then, the portions had been modest. By 1943, such meals had become impossible. The ration cards provided less and less. Meat became a rare luxury, appearing perhaps once every 2 weeks if they were fortunate. Lore remembered standing in line for hours with her ration booklet, waiting for whatever the shops had available that day. Often there was nothing. The shelves sat empty, the shopkeepers apologetic but helpless. The war effort required everything. Civilians made sacrifices so soldiers could eat. That was what they were told, what they accepted as necessary patriotic duty. But even the soldiers had not eaten like this. Her brother, serving with an infantry unit on the Eastern Front, had written letters describing their rations, mostly bread and potatoes, sometimes preserved meat from tins, coffee made from roasted grain because real coffee was unavailable. He never complained in his letters, but Laura could read between the lines. He was always hungry, always tired, always cold. In the bunk below hers, Ushi stirred restlessly. "Laura," she whispered in German, "are you awake?" "Yes." "I keep thinking about my mother," Ushi said softly. "About the last time I saw her, before I left for my posting. She gave me her own ration card for the week, told me to buy something extra before I went. I tried to refuse, but she insisted." Lori heard the catch in Ushi's voice, the tears that threatened to break through. "She probably weighs 40 kilograms by now," Ushi continued. "If she is even still alive. Our city was bombed 3 times before I was captured. I do not know if she survived. And here we are, eating liver and onions like it is, nothing special." Across the barracks, other women were having similar whispered conversations. They spoke of parents and siblings back home, of friends and neighbors all struggling under the same brutal rationing system. They spoke of children receiving smaller and smaller milk portions, of pregnant women unable to get adequate nutrition, of elderly people simply giving up and dying because there was not enough food to sustain the will to live. The guilt settled over them like a heavy blanket. How could they accept such abundance while their families starved? 3 days after their arrival came a holiday. The German women did not understand. The Americans called it Thanksgiving, a tradition, the translator explained, involved giving thanks for harvests and blessings. The prisoners were told that a special meal would be served, something beyond the regular daily fare. The women exchanged skeptical glances. How could there be anything beyond what they were already receiving? The daily meals had already exceeded anything they had imagined possible in a prison camp. On the morning of November 23, 1944, Staff Sergeant Kowalski and his kitchen crew began preparing before dawn. The women could smell the cooking from their barracks, rich aromas that grew stronger as the day progressed. Turkey roasting in massive ovens, sweet potatoes baking with brown sugar and butter, cranberries simmering into sauce, fresh bread rising in warm pans. The scents were overwhelming, almost unbelievable. When the dinner hour arrived, the German prisoners filed into the dining hall and stopped short at what they saw. The serving line had been transformed. Instead of the usual single entree and sides, there were multiple dishes arranged in gleaming metal serving trays. Kowalski stood at the head of the line, carving thick slices from enormous roasted turkeys that glistened with golden brown skin. His staff ladled portions of stuffing, fragrant with herbs and onions, mashed potatoes whipped until they were cloud-light, green beans with almonds, sweet potato casserole topped with pecans, and warm dinner rolls that released steam when broken open. Lore accepted her plate in stunned silence. The amount of food was staggering. There was more on this single plate than her family would have eaten in a week back home. Beside her, young Siggy's eyes had gone very wide, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. Even Tilda, who had maintained her composed dignity through everything, looked shaken by the display. They found seats and simply stared at their plates. Around them, American soldiers were eating with enthusiasm, calling out compliments to Kowalski and his staff, laughing and talking as though this were perfectly normal. One private noticed the German women's frozen expressions and spoke to them in halting German he had been learning. "Gutes Essen," he said with a friendly smile. Good food. Ada looked at the feast before her, and something inside her seemed to crack. Her face, which had remained hard and suspicious for days, suddenly crumpled. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, and she made no effort to wipe them away. "This is not possible," she whispered in German. "This cannot be real. We were told they were starving. We were told America was on the verge of collapse, that their people were suffering, that their soldiers were desperate and hungry." Uschi reached across the table and took Edel's hand. "We were told many things," she said softly. "Perhaps none of them were true." Tilda cut a piece of turkey and tasted it. The meat was moist and perfectly seasoned, falling apart at the touch of her fork. She chewed slowly, deliberately, and when she swallowed, she spoke with quiet certainty that changed everything. "A starving nation does not feed its prisoners like this." The days following Thanksgiving marked a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the camp. The German women began to arrive at mealtimes with less suspicion and more curiosity. They started to pay attention to the Americans who prepared and served their food, watching the easy camaraderie between kitchen staff, the way Kowalski moved through his domain with quiet authority and unmistakable pride. Young Siggy was the first to attempt direct communication. She had always been bold despite her youth, and hunger had taught her that boldness sometimes brought rewards. One morning at breakfast, she approached the serving line where a young private named Danny Martinez was ladling oatmeal into bowls. She pointed at the brown sugar and cinnamon that sat in small containers beside the serving station, and then at her bowl, her meaning clear even without shared language. Martinez grinned and spooned generous amounts of both onto her oatmeal. "There you go, miss," he said, even though he knew she probably did not understand the words. But Siggy understood the tone, the friendliness in his voice. She smiled back, her first real smile since capture, and said "Danke" with genuine warmth. The interaction did not go unnoticed. Other prisoners began testing similar small exchanges. They learned that "please" was the English word for "bitte," that "thank you" meant "danke." The kitchen staff in turn began picking up German phrases from a pocket dictionary that Kowalski kept near the serving line. "Guten Morgen" became the standard breakfast greeting. "Schmeckt gut" meant the food tasted good. Uschi, with her clerical background and natural aptitude for organization, began helping to clear tables after meals without being asked. At first, the American staff tried to stop her, but she persisted with polite determination until they simply accepted her assistance. She worked alongside a corporal named William Chen, whose quiet efficiency reminded her of her own methodical approach to tasks. They communicated primarily through gestures and smiles, but understanding grew between them nonetheless. One afternoon, Chen showed Uschi how the industrial dishwashing equipment worked, a massive machine that sanitized hundreds of plates each day. Her eyes widened with fascination. Back home, such equipment existed only in the largest hotels. Here, it was standard issue for a small prisoner of war camp. The implications were staggering. America's industrial capacity was so vast that even temporary facilities rated machinery that would have been luxury in Germany. Kowalski noticed these developing connections with satisfaction. He had seen it before, this gradual recognition of shared humanity across enemy lines. Food had a way of breaking down barriers that ideology constructed. When you ate together, when you worked together in a kitchen, when you shared the universal experience of a good meal, it became harder to maintain hatred. Not impossible, but harder. He made a point of greeting each prisoner who came through his serving line, making eye contact, nodding with respect. He treated them exactly as he would treat American soldiers, because in his kitchen, that was what military regulations required, and what his conscience demanded. Everyone got fed properly. Everyone got treated with dignity. That was the rule, and Kowalski enforced it absolutely. December brought the first snow and also the first newspapers that changed everything. The camp maintained a small library where prisoners could read, supervised by guards but otherwise unrestricted. American newspapers arrived daily, and while most of the German women struggled with the English text, Lore had been studying diligently with the help of Sergeant Chen's pocket dictionary. Her comprehension improved each day, and with it came a growing sense of dread. The reports filtering back from Europe were becoming more detailed, more horrific. As Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory, they were discovering camps. Not prisoner-of-war camps like the one where Laura now lived, but something else entirely. Places with names she had never heard: Majdanek, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen. The newspaper photographs were grainy and difficult to see clearly, but the accompanying descriptions were unmistakable in their horror. Laura sat in the library with a newspaper spread before her hands trembling as she worked through the English words with her dictionary. Mass murder, systematic extermination, gas chambers, crematoriums, thousands upon thousands of bodies. She read the same sentences multiple times, certain she must be misunderstanding the vocabulary, that her limited English was leading her to incorrect interpretations. But the numbers were clear enough. The photographs, even poorly reproduced, showed things that could not be misinterpreted. Uschi found her there, saw the newspaper, and sat down beside her. "What does it say?" she asked in German. Laura could not answer immediately. Her throat had closed with emotion. Her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. Finally, she managed to speak. "It says that our country built factories for killing people, Jews primarily, but others too. Political prisoners, disabled people, anyone the Reich considered undesirable. It says they murdered millions." The word hung in the air between them. Millions, not thousands, not hundreds. Millions of human beings systematically killed while ordinary Germans like themselves went about their daily lives, worrying about ration cards and air raids and whether their brothers would come home from the front. Within days, more women had read the reports or had them translated by those with better English. The camp commander, recognizing that this information would reach them eventually, decided to address it directly. He arranged for a screening of newsreel footage that American soldiers had filmed when liberating one of the camps. He made attendance optional, but most of the German prisoners chose to watch, driven by a need to know the truth, even if that truth destroyed them. The footage lasted only 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Emaciated bodies stacked like cord wood, survivors so thin they barely seemed human, mass graves being bulldozed, the mechanical efficiency of murder revealed in brutal detail. Several women vomited. Others wept openly. Adele sat frozen, her face drained of all color, staring at the screen even after it went dark. That night, the dining hall was nearly silent. Kowalski served the evening meal, as always, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, fresh bread, apple pie for dessert. But the German women could barely eat. The weeks following the revelations were the hardest. The German women moved through their daily routines like ghosts, haunted by the knowledge of what their country had done. Some withdrew entirely, refusing to speak even to each other. Others became angry, insisting the footage must be propaganda, that such things could not have happened without their knowledge. But most, like Laura and her companions, fell into a numb despair that made even breathing feel like an effort. What made it worse was the continued kindness of their American captors. The kitchen staff still greeted them warmly each morning. Kowalski still prepared meals with the same care and attention. The guards still treated them with basic courtesy and respect. There were no accusations, no demands for apologies, no punishment for crimes they had not personally committed but had unknowingly supported. One evening in late January 1945, Laura found herself alone in the dining hall after the dinner service had ended. She was helping Uschi wipe down tables, a task they had both taken on voluntarily in recent weeks. Kowalski emerged from the kitchen, saw them working, and approached with a container of fresh coffee and 3 cups. "Sit," he said in his rough German, gesturing to the chairs. "Kaffee trinken." They sat awkwardly, unsure what this meant. Kowalski poured coffee for each of them, real coffee with a rich aroma that reminded Laura of childhood mornings before the war. He sat down across from them and sipped his own cup, his weathered face thoughtful. "You are thinking," he said slowly in broken German mixed with English, that Laura could now mostly understand, "that you do not deserve this. The good food, the kindness, yes?" Laura nodded, not trusting her voice. Kowalski set down his cup. "My mother, she came from Poland. She had a saying, 'You cannot punish evil by becoming evil yourself.' You understand?" Laura translated for Ushi, who nodded silently. "You did not build those camps," Kowalski continued. "You did not kill those people. You were lied to, used by evil men. This does not make you evil. It makes you human. Humans can be fooled, but humans can also learn, can change, can become better." He paused, searching for words. "The food I cook, it is not reward, it is not punishment. It is just food. Everyone deserves to eat. This is what makes us human, not animals. We feed even our enemies because that is what civilized people do." The simplicity of his philosophy cut through Laura's despair like light through darkness. She had been so focused on guilt and shame that she had forgotten the possibility of moving forward, of learning from horror rather than being destroyed by it. Over the following weeks, conversations like this became more common. American soldiers who had initially kept their distance began engaging with the prisoners more directly. They shared photographs of their own families, asked about the women's lives before the war, treated them as people rather than abstractions of enemy ideology. 20 years later, in 1965, Hannelore Schmidt Morrison stood in the kitchen of her home in Worcester, Massachusetts, preparing Thanksgiving dinner for her family. Her husband James, a former Army corporal she had met years after the war ended, was setting the table while their 3 children argued cheerfully about who would get the first slice of pie. The house smelled of roasting turkey, sweet potatoes, and fresh bread, aromas that still carried the power to transport her back across 2 decades. She paused in her work, holding a wooden spoon, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. Her life had taken a path she could never have imagined during those cold November days when she first arrived at the POW camp. After repatriation in the summer of 1945, she had returned to a Germany that no longer existed, a landscape of rubble and despair where her family home was gone and her mother had died in the final bombing raids. She had worked for 2 years in displaced persons camps, using her English skills to help process refugees before immigrating back to America in 1947. The decision to return had not been easy, but it had been clear. Germany was rebuilding, slowly finding its way toward a new identity, but America was where Laura had learned the most important lessons of her life. Here, in an enemy prison camp, she had discovered what true civilization meant, not military, power, or industrial might, but the simple, profound act of treating other human beings with dignity even when you had every reason to hate them. Ushi had made a similar choice. She now worked as a translator for the State Department in Washington, helping to build bridges between America and the new West Germany. They exchanged letters frequently, reminiscing about those transformative months when liver and onions had seemed like impossible luxury, when the discovery that meat was served daily had shattered everything they thought they knew about their enemies. Tilda had returned to Germany and become a teacher, dedicating herself to ensuring that future generations understood the truth about the Nazi regime and the importance of critical thinking in the face of propaganda. She wrote to Laura occasionally, letters filled with determination and hope, despite the difficulties of rebuilding a nation from its moral foundations upward. Young Siggy had married an American soldier and settled in Iowa, where she ran a small bakery. Her letters were cheerful and full of recipes, each one a celebration of abundance after years of scarcity. Even Edel, the most suspicious and resistant, had eventually softened. She had returned to Germany but maintained correspondence with several of the American soldiers who had guarded them, exchanging Christmas cards and occasional letters that acknowledged the unexpected friendships formed across enemy lines. But it was Kowalski's lesson that Laura had carried most deeply into her life. The importance of feeding people properly, of showing dignity through simple acts of care. She had passed this lesson to her children, teaching them that how you treat others when you have power over them reveals who you truly are.